Hello, everyone, and thanks for watching. My name is Lindsay Remore, and I'm happy to be sharing a project with you today which examines the intersection of timbre semantics, orchestration, and form with an approach that I call timbre trait analysis. As what I'm talking about today represents a slice of a larger work in progress, I'm going to first share my longer-term vision for the project. I'll then provide some background in the subfields of timbre semantics and orchestration analysis. Next, I'll summarize how I developed a cognitive linguistic model of musical instrument timbre qualia, and I'll describe the subsequent process of generating a set of 34 timbre trait profiles for common instruments used in Western large ensembles. I'll then describe how these profiles can be applied through computational analysis to illustrate how the semantic dimensions of instrumentation evolve over the duration of a piece. Using the first movement of Mahler's First Symphony as a case study, we'll discover how information about the semantics of instrumentation can be brought into conversation with formal functions, exploring specifically how instrumentation becomes literally pivotal in the realization of the climactic Durchbruch or breakthrough moment of the first movement. First, we'll take a look at the big picture. While I'm focusing with you on a single analysis today, my ultimate vision is to provide an orchestration analysis tool addressing instrumental semantics. Once I've refined this set of tools, I plan to make them available online in an open source format. I see this as a resource for research as well as teaching, something that can be used by both scholars and students in the core music theory curriculum and in the composition or orchestration classroom. In sum, the user is going to be able to upload a file of notated music to an online application. The output of the program will be a series of summative visualizations and descriptive statistics about how instrumental semantics vary throughout the piece. You'll see an example of these today. The output of the program is not intended to be an end in itself, but rather a navigable summary of the piece that can be used for both close and distant readings. On one hand, inputting a single piece can provide the theorist grounds for deeper interpretation. This is the process I'll be modeling today. On the other hand, I'm looking forward to using the program as the basis for a hypothesis-driven corpus studies of orchestration and form. The project I am describing today focuses on timbre semantics. However, I look forward to integrating this tool with the online resource called Orchard, which is currently being developed by the Actor Project. In the fall, I'll be joining this project, the Analysis, Creation, and Teaching of Orchestration, as a postdoctoral fellow at McGill. My vision is that my semantics data and program will be accessible in tandem with the data about orchestration techniques and perceptual effects that is being generated through other ongoing projects at Actor, allowing for the possibility of multidimensional corpus studies involving score, linguistic, and perceptual data. Now for some background. My work straddles two exciting and relatively new areas of inquiry: timbre semantics and the relationship between timbre and formal function. In timbre semantics, one subject we can address is qualia. So we can ask what phenomenological experiences are evoked by musical timbres, and what is it like to experience a given timbre? And then how do those experiences have meaning for us as listeners? How do they contribute to musical meanings? One way into these questions is through linguistics. So I ask what we can learn from how people are communicating about the meaning and experience of musical timbres through language. Leonard Meyer classified timbre as a secondary parameter. However, recent scholars, including Stephen McAdams and Jean-Jacques Nattier, have called this into question, asking whether timbre might in some cases be a primary parameter. Even in music where we might not think of it as traditionally primary, timbre clearly does play an important structuring role in music and in emotional experience of music that has not yet been thoroughly investigated. And as with timbre semantics, my interest in the nexus of timbre and music theory comes back to meaning. How do timbral meanings contribute to the experience of music, and particularly of musical structure? What roles do timbre and orchestration have in defining formal function? How do they contribute to motivic and thematic transformation? So in all stories, doesn't just matter what's being said. We need to know which character said it and who that character is, what their personality is like. So we might ask how timbral characters are actually working within musical narratives. Okay, on to the timbre trait profiles. I'm going to give some background on how I developed these. We can think of these profiles as prototypical cognitive linguistic character sketches of musical instruments. So in a previous project, so it's forthcoming in psychomusicology, I conducted open-ended interviews with 23 musicians who imagined and described the timbres of various musical instruments. Performing content analysis of their 4,809 remarks or component ideas resulted in a preliminary model. Next, 460 musician participants rated a set of musical instruments using this preliminary model, resulting in a 20-dimensional final model of musical instrument timbre qualia. In that previous rating task, participants had used the preliminary model to describe a set of instruments. However, I wanted to accumulate descriptions for an even larger set of instruments, and I wanted to do this with my shiny new 20-dimensional model. So I asked 243 participants to rate 34 common large ensemble instruments on the 20 dimensions of the model. This study resulted in a set of timbre trait profiles. So now you might be asking, what is a timbre trait profile and what does it look like? Well, here is an example of the timbre trait profile for the flute. So the full quantitative profile consists of average ratings for each of the 20 dimensions for each instrument. But we can visualize these data using a radar plot as pictured here. The 20 dimensions are listed around the circumference of the circle. There are things like raspy grainy, brassy metallic, and hollow. The circle radius goes from 1 on the inside to 7 on the outside, where 1 is indicating the participants didn't think the term applied to this instrument's timbre, and 7 indicates the term applies very maximally to that timbre. Thus, we can see that the flute received its highest ratings on pure clear, airy breathy here, and soft singing out here. And then on the side, I've given a table that summarizes the top 6 most highly rated terms for the flute. And here's a slide with just 6 of the profiles of very different instruments. Just to get a quick visual impression, I'm not going to give you enough time to really look at this, but the slides are available for your later perusal. You can just kind of get an impression that these things have different shapes and thus different timbres. A few caveats regarding these timbre trait profiles, or TTPs as I will probably refer to them, as that these are portraits of an instrument's typical quality of sound. So obviously instrumental timbres can be used in atypical ways that can serve a variety of really important aesthetic purposes. But it's helpful to think about these terms kind of like personality descriptors. So I might be accurately described as having a bubbly personality, for example, but that doesn't imply that I'm going to be equally bubbly in all circumstances. At the same time, it doesn't nullify the usefulness of the descriptor bubbly. Second, we know timbre is changing with dynamic and register, among other factors. Again, as these profiles are based on a typical or average sound, the model is not accounting for these flexibilities, at least yet. Of course, the profiles are culturally and instrumentally constrained. So these are Western classical instruments, and all my participants are Western culture, and the interviews were American. The data from the rating studies are a little bit more wide globally. Taken together, we have to see these kind of as rough and ready portraits and be careful about how we use them in what circumstances. But how can we use them? So we're going to take a look and a listen to how these timbre trait profiles can inform our understanding of the first movement of Mahler's First Symphony. So for this initial analysis, I encoded instrumentation manually, kind of beat by beat. I'm looking forward to being able to use XML in the future. Even with XML, however, there's still going to be a fairly big time commitment for encoding an entire symphonic work, at least until we have better optical recognition software. So for each beat of the piece, the program is calculating an average value for the model's 20 semantic dimensions. I've chosen to represent this as an average. So the total value of a given dimension is divided by how many instruments are playing at that beat, so that semantic values are not skewed by sheer number of sound source types. So finally, we're just going to run this program through R, or run the encoded file through R, and it's going to produce graphs of the semantics of instrumentation, including some of the following I'm about to show you. But first, a few quick words on caveats again. First, this type of analysis is it's telling us about the personalities of what instruments a composer is choosing to combine at any moment. It's not giving us direct information about blends or about perceptual effects. And the analysis as it stands is not accounting for intensity. It's not accounting for whether an instrument is playing solo or tutti, which is going to have timbral implications. And of course, while I do have 34 profiles, and that includes a lot of percussion and saxophones, not everything is going to be available. So in the case of the Mahler, there's some A clarinet, and I needed to use the B-flat clarinet as a sort of proxy for that. And again, extended techniques are not yet mapped out. So in the Mahler, the string harmonics in the beginning and the offstage brass are not represented here. Again, rough and ready, but despite this, I was able to observe many interesting things about the movement. The simplest first step is just to look at the evolving instrumentation over the course of the piece. This graph shows on the y-axis, it's not the number of instruments playing, but it's the number of types of instruments playing. So we can think of it as some sort of index of instrumental diversity. The x-axis represents the measure numbers. Formal boundaries are given with the blue lines, while the red horizontal line represents the average number of instruments playing across the piece. Megan Goodchild's typology of orchestral gestures is useful here. We can look for addition or reduction of instrumental forces that are either gradual or sudden. For example, we can see the gradual reduction occurring before the formal boundaries of the exposition and development, but the sudden reduction happening at the recapitulation. We can see that Mahler uses fewer instrument types than average in the introduction, but more than average in the recap. Remember that red line is the average. And we can see the peak in instrumental diversity occurring right at the climax of the movement. In sum, instrumental diversity appears to be intimately linked with formal boundaries here. I don't have time to unpack everything from this graph, but I just wanted to point a few things to show that even a simple account of the instrumentation holds a lot of useful information. But we've got to move on to the semantic dimensions. So we can look at graphs for each of the dimensions of the model across the piece. So this is a sample. It's the graph for the dimension that includes the terms sparkling, shimmering, brilliant, and bright. Again, x-axis is measure numbers. The y-axis, though, is sort of the average sparkling brilliantness of the instrumentation on a scale from 0 to 6. And again, the red line is the average, this time of the average sparkling brilliantness over the whole piece. We can see that Mahler reserves instrumentation that might be considered more sparkling brilliant than average for certain purposes. So this dimension is hanging out mostly below average in that sort of ethereal cloud of the introduction, even when you see these little peaks in here that are resulting from the offstage trumpet fanfares. So using graphs like the one in the previous slide and the corresponding data, we can ask whether individual formal sections of a piece might be characterized by the use of combinations of instruments with particular semantic associations, more so than others. This is a table of each formal section of the Mahler, along with a list of the qualia dimensions that I found to be emphasized above average in that section in respect to the instrumentation. So for example, the introduction features instruments that are considered to be more rumbling low, raspy grainy, muted veiled, hollow, and direct loud. We can see that sparkling brilliant is blossoming in the exposition and the development, and that brassiness emerges in the development and recap. This is all relative to the other sections. And the instrumentation semantics here tell a nice little narrative, I think, and one that's consistent with what we might expect of formal functions and of my experience with the piece. Now we're going to dive a little deeper into the moment of breakthrough in this piece, or Durchbruch. But of course, we have to listen to it. By the way, if you want more Mahler 1 Durchbruch, check out my colleague Sam Burgess's presentation, The Changing Performance of Durchbruch in Mahler Symphony No. 1, which is also on the MTMW program. She very kindly agreed to let me use her reduction in the figure on this slide, which I find to be really helpful in listening to this moment. The excerpt is going to start from the build to the climax, and our recording here is of the LA Phil with Gustavo Dudamel conducting. moment there's the breakthrough, the Durchbruch, and that sustains that kind of excitement for about 6 measures and then cadences into the recapitulation. So there's precedent here for timbral considerations of Mahler's Durchbruch moments. Adorno casts his discussions of the concept of Durchbruch in a timbral light. In an article from 2006, Scheinbaum draws attention to the importance of timbre in Adorno's account and argues that Mahler uses instrumental color to announce the arrival of Durchbruch passages and to set them apart from the rest of the movement. So in my research, I'm asking what compositional processes are leading to this effect and what instrumental characters are contributing to this experience of breakthrough. So another way to look at the semantics data is to plot the beat-to-beat change in the semantics of the instrumentation. So here, again, measure numbers on the x-axis, but on the y-axis, total change in qualia. We're looking at a small excerpt of the piece. We're narrowing in on the moments surrounding the Durchbruch. What we learn from looking at the entire piece, which is not pictured here, is that the semantics of the instrumentation are just constantly changing in Mahler. This section is really typical right here where you've got all these peaks. The instruments are weaving in and out of the texture constantly. And it's this kind of consistency of tumult in the instrumentation that makes the period surrounding the Durchbruch really stand out. It's by far the longest period of minimal instrumental change or instrumental semantic change in the movement. So given this data, we might ask what exactly is happening to the instrumentation here. So first and most obviously, this is a slice from the earlier slide with just simply the number of instrument types playing. The diversity of instrument types explodes at the Durchbruch and it's at its climax, it's at its peak. And we can observe this big jump here, right, at the Durchbruch from 12 to 19 instrument types and over a dozen voices that are added to the chorus. And then a steep decrease here right at the moment of cadence. We might expect sort of when you come into a climax that there's going to be some sort of big build, and maybe that happens through progressive orchestration. However, I found that in this period leading up to the breakthrough, qualia changes are actually nearly static. Tensions instead built primarily in other ways. The moment of breakthrough itself, though, is marked by this sudden change in orchestration, an accompanying change in timbre qualia that resonates with the affective import of the moment. Similarly, another really important change in timbre qualia is occurring at the moment of release as the music resolves into the recapitulation 6 bars later. It's this little peak here, with logical corresponding changes in timbre qualia. So we could say that the experience of the build itself, it's generated primarily through harmonic tension and increasing momentum through intensifying rhythm. The breakthrough, though, arrives through the orchestration. Not only does semantic diversity increase, but the character of the instrumentation changes. The reliance on means other than a progressive orchestration for this build of tension means the effect of the sudden addition of instruments is that much greater. So how exactly are these semantics changing? Well, looking at the 2 graphs on the bottom half of the slide here, the x-axis now is an index in change in qualia. So bars going to the right say that at this moment it's increasing, and bars going to the left that it's decreasing. And the y-axis is listing prominent changes in qualia by dimension. So the graph on the left corresponds to the Durchbruch, and the graph on the right is the cadence. The dimensions are listed in the same order on both graphs so that we can observe this pendulum effect of semantics in which nearly all of the qualia are just swinging in the opposite direction. So looking at the types of qualia that increase during the Durchbruch, things like percussive, brassy, direct loud, shrill noisy, ringing long, they make sense. They're consistent with what we probably hear in the music. And again, keep in mind, these are not descriptors of the music itself, but rather are descriptors of the types of instruments that are being used at this moment. So we could say that in this case, the instrumental character strongly matches the character of the music. Mahler is capitalizing on the prototypical characters of many of these instruments in order to activate the emotional import of these key musical moments. So in sum, in this presentation, I've described the process that I used to develop the cognitive linguistic model of the dimensions of musical instrument timbre qualia and the generation of the timbre trait profiles through further empirical study. I described how these profiles can be used in computational analysis, which can visualize the overall semantic character of instrumentation throughout a piece of music. Using the example of the first movement of Mahler 1, I shared observations related to instrumental semantics and formal boundaries, to demonstrate how this analysis can reveal large-scale patterns. But to demonstrate the potential for the analysis to assist in the interpretation of focused musical moments, I shared observations on the Durchbruch moment of the same movement, illustrating how the phenomenal import of the moment is related to the use of instrumental characters. As I undertake more analyses, I'll be working on refining and streamlining the method, which will include further empirical work to address caveats of the method. As described in the beginning of the presentation, I look forward to an end product that's available for public use online. So thank you for tuning in today. I look forward to answering any questions you might have either in the webinar or via email. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. And the slides from this presentation are going to be posted online for your perusal. Thank you.